Joining Zamani and I, we have Jonathan Turner. He is the head of retail operations. We have Felicia Hlophe. She is a legal advisor in our retail legal team. And then we have Faizil Jakoet, who's the head of our retail client services. So thank you for joining us today. Felicia, my first question is for you. What are the key principles to consider when it comes to data ethics?
Thanks, Derwina. I think I want to start off just by saying that the concept of data ethics can be defined as the study of the moral issues that relate to data. So the collection, the processing, the further processing, the storage, the management of data. So with that being said, I'd say the first key principle would be accountability, and this relates to the responsible party. And the responsible party is the organization that manages, that collects, that stores the data. And I would say that accountability cannot be transferred or avoided when it pertains to the data subjects. And then I would say the second principle would probably be security safeguards. So, for example, POPIA actually is a risk-based approach. And so that being said, it's not a one-size-fits-all for all organizations. I think organizations then need to look at and see what works for them in their specific circumstances. And then I would say the third the third principle would be purpose specification. And that relates to the fact that through all processing, there needs to be at least one lawful basis for processing information. So that could either be consent from the data subject themselves. It could be related to a contractual obligation or a legal obligation that a responsible party has. It also could relate to a legitimate interest that the responsible party has or the data subject has in order for the responsible party to process that information. Then the last key principle I would say would be transparency, and that relates to openness and just having your privacy statement where your clients know why, what, how, when is information collected, where is it stored, what is it being used for. I think the more transparent an organization is, not only with their clients and also with the people within the business, this creates a great deal of trust because there's no point in having policies, but no one knows like what you're doing when you're collecting the personal information. And because of that, nobody would want to do business with you. So I think, transparency is a very big one. So in summary, I would say for me, the four key principles would be accountability, transparency, openness, purpose specification, as well as security safeguards.
Okay. So with that in mind, we've obviously got a lot of ethical considerations we need to meet. We have a lot of regulations as a company that we need to oblige by. Mm-hmm. How does Allan Gray ensure that they're meeting these requirements and also making sure at the same time they're doing what's right for the clients?
So I think when we think about data processing, I think it's important to always keep at the forefront the data subject. So for example, we as an organization, we get subpoenas maybe like once or twice a month, and we have a legal obligation to comply with those subpoenas. A subpoena is an infringement on the right of privacy, but it's a legal justification on the infringement of right of privacy. So when we then received subpoenas, we had a relook at our process, and we decided, you know what, in order to, again, instill that confidence, instill that trust with our clients, we decided to include in our process just to send a courtesy email to clients to say, this is a subpoena that we received. Normally the subpoenas are for like divorces or maintenance orders where the courts are asking for financial information of a client. And although we are legally obliged to provide that information, just going a step further and thinking about our clients and thinking about, again, instilling confidence, instilling trust when we are dealing with clients' personal information, we then send out that courtesy email just to inform a client, listen, we received this subpoena, this is the information that we provided, that's it. And I think, again, it just goes back to the transparency principle of it all. So I think, in all the processes, you need to think about your clients. And while thinking about clients as well, we have a PAIA request form. So PAIA is the Promotion of Access to Information Act. With that form, it's not just a tick box exercise where we receive a form and we just give out the information willy-nilly. our information officer actually sits down with the form, and we advise people that request information to have the rights clearly specified as to what rights are you trying to protect by obtaining this information. And we engage with the form. And so for us, it's very important to just not have like a tick box exercise when you do things, but really engage. And because I think at the end of the day, that shows that you not only care about your clients, but you care about your clients' personal information, which they are actually entrusting you with.
Okay. Yeah. So important to you have no obligation whatsoever to keep clients in the loop. It's a court order that comes to you.
Yes.
But it's really important for you to make sure you're keeping the trust with your clients.
Yes.
And being transparent around it.
And being transparent, exactly.
Okay. All right, John, I'm going to move over to you. So having a data ethics policy is one piece of it, but you have to obviously operationalize this. What are some of the measures you take to operationalize this in Allan Gray?
Yeah, so I suppose with all policies, it's quite difficult to, if you start with a policy, so let's take a data policy, there's a lot of detail in that. Those policies generally flow from regulation. So, if you think about some of the things that Felicia's been chatting about, they can become quite technical. So I think what's really important with policies, especially when you've got lots of staff you're dealing with, is that you take those policies and you turn them into something practical. So how that flows down from your compliance department, from your legal department into something that someone who has to make a decision whether or not to share this piece of information with a new client or someone who's asking for something because there's a subpoena. I suppose, how do your people on the ground make those decisions, and how well do you translate that change in regulation or those policies into something practical? So I think that's really important. Obviously, as these things flow through the organization, there'll be training. If we've implemented a new policy which has big changes to process, we'll come back and we'll test those changes to make sure that the policies are being followed properly. And I think what's also very important when you do these things is to think about how they align with your business culture. So, if you think about the client service example or the client principles that we have when we make changes to products, when we implement legislation, we always do it with a client lens. So when our consultants or our teams are making calls, they can see it from that perspective. And I suppose with these policies as well is to make sure that the people in the organization have a very clear understanding on what the overall sort of view or regulation is trying to change. So if you understand the first principles of what you're trying to implement, then you're going to have a much better chance of someone making quite really good decisions and actually giving effect to the spirit of the regulation or the policy.
Okay. So when it comes to advisors, what measures do you think they can implement to make data ethics part of their day-to-day operations?
Yeah, I think it's quite tricky to make a call without understanding the practice, understanding the resources that they have access to. So I've just gone through some of the things that Allan Gray does to make sure that we implement properly. So really it depends on what they have access to. I think is to make sure that from a process design perspective, that's probably where, if I had a smaller business and I didn't have massive resources, I would spend time making sure that the process design is secure and probably a little bit less sort of in terms of some of the change management pieces. And then I would also say I think it makes sense if you haven't got the expertise in the organization to go outside, and speak to people like Zamani or speak to some of the content or subject matter experts. So when you do that design and you do train your staff that you're doing the best. I mean, not all of us can be experts. In our organization as well, we rely on subject matter experts, and I think that does help to make sure the thing you finally implement works as it should.
Okay. Faizil, I think this next question's for you. We see some data breaches, we see companies getting hacked, important data being leaked. At Allan Gray, how can we make it safer for clients to do business from a data protection perspective? Like, what are the measures we have in place?
So Zamani presented a sort of risk management slide a bit earlier, which sort of highlights everything related to kind of infrastructure, protection mechanisms, vulnerability testing, penetration testing, et cetera, et cetera. And we do all of that, as is mentioned. But I think in addition to that, when you think about some of the processes or operational processes that sort of impact clients and advisors at the front end. Some of these are things are really kind of authentication related. So how do we ensure we have the processes in place to ensure that the parties or the subjects requesting information or has access to certain pieces of information are authorized to do so? And so we do that through sort of multiple levels of security, of authentication, effectively, and that spans across biometrics or additional factors of authentication, both when calling and requesting information as well as accessing information through a secure online portal of some sort. In addition to that, we, I suppose, what you ideally want to do is reduce the volume of sensitive information that gets transmitted over the internet or email. Emails become quite a challenging channel because I guess the levels of security that's applied to email these days are not necessarily, it doesn't really give me a lot of comfort. And so you really want to be reducing the amount of sensitive information being sent out over the internet or even via old channels like post. So it's essentially about taking data from unsecured locations and putting them in secure locations.
Okay. So it sounds like from a data ethics perspective, Allan Gray is doing a lot to make sure that we are having, reducing the amount of data out there and making sure that we have a lot in place to protect clients' data. But I'm sure that there's still instances where there are some sort of ethical dilemmas that come up from a client servicing perspective. What are these ethical dilemmas and how do you tackle them?
Yeah, to be honest, I on a day-to-day basis, I don't think there are many. I think we use and process data broadly for three reasons. One, there's a regulatory requirement. Two, from a security perspective, to verify and authenticate that people are who they say they are. And the third reason we use data is really to, I guess, analyze data to ensure we provide a better client experience at the end of the day. So we don't really use data for sort of other purposes, marketing, spamming, etc., or on-selling products and so forth. So to be honest, we're not really faced with many dilemmas on a day-to-day basis. Of course, we have considerations such as how long do you store data, what data do you store, I suppose in holding ourselves accountable to ensure that the reasons why we're gathering, collecting and saving the data are for one of those three purposes I've mentioned earlier.
Faizil, how do you, sorry to interject there, but how do you define the parameters for improving client experience?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the one area in particular, I mean, an example of that is when we try and understand why clients typically end up having to contact us or follow up in particular requests. The better we understand those reasons, it allows us to, it sort of allows a great sort of data input to ensuring you improve your services in future. And so, as an example, the need for clients to have to contact us, is there an option for them not needing to do that, which frees up more time on their side?
So I think it's the what I'm trying to highlight there is how do you balance out the spectrum of kind of, because to your point, right, some of these things are challenges that you deem that the consumer would like to have,
yes.
But how are you actually validating that so that you're not running off on a tangent where you're not processing information for a thing you think this is super important, but the client's like,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a difficult, I mean, it's mostly judgment.
Okay.
Mostly judgment. And I guess from an accountability, as I mentioned, from an accountability perspective, you never really just have sort of one party involved. You're always discussing and debating whether that piece of data is necessary to track. And so where we're constantly evaluating what data we track to ensure whether we currently use it or whether there's a future. So
there's an ongoing process of basically reviewing whether it's in accordance with those primary three principles and whether the kind of, to John's point earlier, right, that it's customer centric.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and so it's really client behavior data rather than sort of client demographic
Yeah.
data. and always utilized for purposes within the firm as opposed to kind of on sharing that data to any other third party.
Okay.
I think also just to your point, Zamani, is that I think it's important to note that the applying the regulations and complying with the legislation, it's not a one and done thing. It's a thing of constantly having to review, constantly having to see if, your business parameters, what you've set, the policies are still in line with your client needs, and also just with business needs, and also with your employees, of course. So it's definitely not a one and done. It's a constant process of reviewing, refining, and you have to be flexible. I think legislation is always changing. There's new things popping up. I think you mentioned this also in your presentation. So you need to be flexible with your policies. You need to be flexible in your reviews.
Okay. So on that, I think you touched on one of the next questions, Felicia, but in terms of how can an advisor, like you said, regulations are always changing, you're needing to constantly review as well. How can they ensure they're staying up to date with these things, making sure that they're still meeting clients' needs, making sure they're still compliant with the laws, as well as looking at this overarching ethical principles that we have in place?
So I think maybe I just want to backtrack. I'll answer your question, but I want to answer it in a roundabout way, just to say that, so for example, when we look at POPIA, right? POPIA promotes the protection of privacy, right? But at the same time, it also advances the flow of information. So you can look at that and think that there's a tension there, but actually there's not really a tension, because the right to privacy is not absolute. So your privacy can be limited in certain instances where it's justifiable to do so. So with the business and with advisors, it's like this thing of the business having to look out for the business's legitimate interest in collecting and processing information in order to set out or perform on their mandate, with also this right of clients having to protect their personal information and respect their personal information, right? So I think how this can be managed is, again, going back to the principles that I mentioned, creating clear accountability measures, creating a culture of being aware and being committed to ethics, and also being committed to uprooting unethical behavior within an organization, I think is very important. And I think also applying TCF principles, treating clients fairly principles, that also comes in, because that's not just a code of rules that you need to follow. It's also about the culture. It's a lived culture that an organization needs to have. So I think, when you look at that, and when you also consider that data privacy can't be just an afterthought anymore, and it can't be a haphazard thing anymore when you look at the organizations or businesses that have been fined because they weren't following their policies or they were negligent in their policies, and also just the reputational damage that causes to a business it's great. So I think for advisors, step one would obviously be having your data privacy policies, definitely. And then also I would say recommended that, well, not recommended because it's in legislation, that you have to appoint someone to oversee the implementation of those policies. So your information officer is important. And I would also say that for advisors, it's important to have a data management framework, so that you know exactly where your data sits, you know how your data is collected. I think this also assists in managing and mitigating risk, because you know exactly where your data sits. You can look out for potential breaches, and in that vein as well, having a data breach management policy that will help you effectively and efficiently do your investigations and do your reports to the data subject as mandated by legislation, and also do your reports to the information regulator. So I think all of these things, it's not just one aspect of the business that this affects, or one department within a business that this affects. It needs to permeate from management all the way down. Because as I think John had mentioned, that you can have a policy, but you need training. Your people need to know what's going on. and how they can set out and comply with the policies within the company. So yeah, I think it's you need to look at it from different perspectives, from different angles. But I think all the time you need to have the focus on that you need to respect. You need to do what you need to do, but you need to respect this personal information that's been entrusted with you.
Okay, so you're talking around there's a lot of there's all these laws we need to comply with, and not complying with them, there's you're subject to massive fines, obviously. But more than that, like if I can move over to John, right? Obviously, this information getting into the wrong hands opens up a big risk, especially in the financial services industry, right? One of those being the concern we have around fraudsters now getting access to this data. So, like, what are the common ways that you are seeing in the operations area?
Yeah, good question. It's firstly important to say, and I'm sure what I'm about to say won't surprise anyone who's listening to the webinar, is that the amount of activity we're seeing outside of the building from a fraudulent perspective is up. So in the last 2 years, we've seen a significant increase, and that's not limited to Allan Gray. When I speak to my peers at some of the other platforms and where we've got various forums where we share information, where we share data, it's up. So I think that's probably worth mentioning. So yeah, all the advisors out there, if you're paranoid, then it's probably not a bad thing to be. I think it's up. From a modus operandi perspective, or the kind of scenarios we're seeing, really, I think the kind of the sort of main data that's being breached, obviously you've got sort of a client's name, surname, you've got the ID number. Those kinds of things I think fraudsters get hold of very easily. What we're seeing with some of these data leaks, and some of them are old and some of them have sort of been more recent. Fraudsters are getting access to clients' emails. So we spoke a little bit earlier about the sort of email intercept. So that's definitely an MO that we're seeing. And what generally happens, as you saw in the presentation, an advisor is dealing with a client, and it would be the client that's initiated a transaction. It might be a transfer of money, as sort of the one case from the client to a service provider, or it might be a client wanting money out of their own account. And then somewhere in that interaction, the advisor or the financial advisor assistant is no longer actually dealing with the client, but they're dealing with the fraudster who's purporting to be the client. And that fraudster has access to the client's email. So now the fraudster they basically have access to all the client's information. They can change the client's bank details. They can change, if the advisor shares a proof of bank account, for example, with one of the service providers with a client, the fraudster will get in. They'll change that proof of bank. So we're seeing lots happen over there. And that generally, as I've mentioned, it either starts with a change in client details. That's generally the first place you see. There will be a change in bank, and then the fraudster will come and try and do that. And they generally do it over quite a sort of a short space of time. And then the other area where we've seen lots of fraud, and this also has it sort of goes in waves, but I would say it's been sustained now probably for the last year, is in the estate late space. So it's very clear that fraudsters have access to all the information at the master's office. A fraudster will arrive at your platform with a letter of executorship, with the ID of the executor, with a death certificate. You can ask them anything you want, and they'll. It seems like they've got access to all of that. So that's the space where we're seeing lots of activity.
Okay. All right, John and Faizil, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I just want to go over on the email security that you're talking about, John. This email correspondence between an advisor and a client is being intercepted, and the client is none the wiser that they're talking now to a fraudster. So Zamani, obviously this is quite a critical piece we need to have in place, email security. What can you tell our financial advisors? What would be something useful for them to do when it comes to securing this email communication between themselves and their client?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, right? Because it's almost like with every piece of innovation we have, there's almost like a new and emerging risk that comes from it, right? So there's a piece around kind of what Felicia spoke to, which is around you need to document kind of the policies that you have in place, right? So if something does actually happen, it can be someone's going to stress test it and be able to say, look, we did everything reasonably within our power to prevent this from taking place. And then kind of going to your points around what does the tech stack have to look like in order to protect against that. So you want to do things like kind of authentication on sensitive documents, right? So password protecting information that, to John's point, you've got IDs, highly sensitive information in that particular document. You want to make sure that things around kind of the password controlling of those actual email accounts is robust, right? So no one wants a password at one being the password. You want to make sure that those policies are correct. You furthermore want to make sure that you've got things like multi-factor authentication in place to make sure that, and that's, I see everyone nodding their head because that's a big thing, right? So making sure that when people are logging into those particular accounts, it's verified as them. And ultimately, again, these things all need to be documented. I know, as I said earlier on, a lot of financial advisor firms use things such as Microsoft Office 365. They've got Outlook. They might be using a Gmail, and those platforms will typically have some form of robust protections and mechanisms that they can be applied, and I would advise kind of most people to have those in place. And you've always got to think about also having some kind of ongoing vulnerability scanning around your domain, which I think again I intimated earlier that when you have, as an example, John at allangray.coza being recreated as John2 at allangray.com, and all of a sudden a person will think, oh yeah, this is John, I'm going to send him that information because we have that rapport. So making sure that kind of those things are being monitored on an ongoing basis. But it's basically, you've got to take the step back and make sure that you're for lack of a better word, you're throwing the kitchen sink at the problem, and secondly that you're actually you're documenting that so that if it does come under pressure or duress, it can be verified that you actually were doing what you were supposed to do.
So just to maybe expand on what Zamani said, John and Faizil, if you can maybe talk around like what are things that advisors can use that Allan Gray provides to be able to make sure that their clients' data is secure. John, do you want to go first, and then Faizil, we can switch over to you.
Yeah, from a data security perspective, I think, if you look at our online website, the information that we have there is secure, it's locked down, and there's some enhancements which are flowing through, which Faizil will probably chat to. So I think that's important. Just from a client security perspective, so I think what's really important, and I've mentioned is your client's contact details are really the first place that you'll see a fraudster will start. And then also it's quite difficult, and I can imagine for advisors in particular, if your practice is very busy and you've got lots of processes and procedures running, and really it's a bit like going through airport security. It's one in millions and millions of people that are actually carrying something suspicious or something which they shouldn't take on a plane, but everyone's got to be pushed through that process. So I think for advisors to try and think of their processes and see if there's a way they can, for certain kinds of things that are a little bit more risky, those things can be, sent to a second sort of check. If it's one assistant doing it, maybe if a client details changes, then it goes to, the assistant's colleague or an advisor to check, or sort of something like that. It's also important, I think, in that sort of fraudulent transactional space, what fraudsters generally do is they try and create a sense of urgency. So they'll say to you, if you don't do this payment now, or we need this now, or we want it now, and if those kinds of things happen. So what we found is if you slow things down, even if it's by a few hours or a day, then often it'll then come to light that there's something going on, which needs to be highlighted. So really looking at your client's data, keeping your client's data up to date. And then also we spoke a little bit about bank details. So advisors would have noticed we've just removed our bank details from all the forms. So really we can collect money on behalf of your clients, which is a secure way to do it. Or, if you go into all the major banks, our pre-approved bank accounts loaded there. That's a far more secure way than sending information across, via email. So it's probably those few things I'd highlight, yeah.
Good. And actually, just sorry, Faizil, before you comments, I just wanted to make a comment that, one of the recent cases where a business was fined was because of the whole change of the banking details, where fraudsters got onto the email of the corporate, and they changed the banking details, and a client not knowing, they paid money into that bank account, and all fraud. So as you said, like we've now embarked on that initiative of removing all our banking details on our forms and rather collecting the money from the clients or having it pre-populated on the apps.
And it's probably just on that point, because I've mentioned a lot of things advisors should be doing and how things go wrong. You know, in our business, and you talk about data, we do use data to make sure that where there are patterns emerging and we think fraud might happen, we'll jump in. So that's something we've been investing in from a data science perspective. We do lots of checks and verifications with various banks and those things. But fraudsters are no longer one or two people sitting in a garage. They're very sophisticated and they're very good with data. They somehow know a lot more about our clients than you'd want them to. So I think it's something to keep in mind.
Faizil, to add to that?
Yeah, like the only thing I can add is, we spoke about sort of multiple levels of security, MFA or multi-factor authentication. And for a long time, in the earlier years, companies tend to resist it because of the friction that it may cause. And there's always this toss-up between, I guess, kind of lock things down completely on the one end and the implication being friction, difficulties, as opposed to kind of just, kind of one simple step to access. But, where we are today, we're way past that. I think the risk over the sort of last 5-10 years level of cybersecurity, which I think is why people like Zamani can, and many like him could consult, sort of always busy flying around talking about cybersecurity. It's obviously become a big thing, and businesses need to level up security appropriately. So in the advisor space, we're expecting to deploy an additional factor when logging into the online security portal in the next few weeks. And although, as I mentioned earlier, or John mentioned, the importance of maintaining sort of up-to-date details both for advisors themselves as well as their clients is critically important. You always want these sort of multiple levels of security such that, if an imposter or fraudster breaks through one, that it gets caught on the other. And so, for example, where your identity might be compromised and fraudsters try and access your details, they're unable to do so, or if they do get in, you'll be notified through either your email or SMS or sort of mobile phone that activity has happened on your account. And so, I think security, appropriate sort of levels of security is really a sort of multi-strategy play or multiple levels of defense.
You want like multiple fail-safes, right? So if one thing fails, kind of it'll be flagged.
It's caught in the end.
And I think the thing there that people need to understand around tech companies is that, as much as technology is great and people are innovating, we need to make sure that the security solutions have those innovations embedded within them, right? So people are talking about using generative AI for X, Y, and Z, but is that actually being used on the protection side, right? How are those technologies? You look at something like Bitcoin, which gives people a way to transfer money anonymously. It's great for innovation and general ledger issues, but at the same time you're now to some degree financing terrorism. So there's a constant balance, and it's kind of to Felicia's point around that ethical discussion from a public sector perspective as to whether the technologies that are being deployed and being used are actually, are they facilitating trade? Are they helping the economy? And I think it's an ongoing challenge, but I think advisors need to be always kept abreast of kind of what's developing and the trends that are taking place in the market space.
So with that, Faizil, one of the things you also spoke about as well was about friction. And I can imagine servicing friction being one of the key things that advisors face, that you face as well in your space as well. Like, how would you encourage advisors to be educating their clients around these things, especially when you have, working from home or people nomad life and, hotspotting on Wi-Fi's as well, and the risk that opens up for them?
I think firstly, there's got to be a level of consciousness wherever you're adding personal information on what appears to be legitimate sort of shopping sites. You want to be careful with that sort of stuff. I think you want to be very careful when dealing with your financial matters, adding credentials in any sort of public space, unsecured space. I think typically in your office or in your personal home, it's probably the safest places to do so, provided that the levels of sort of security has been applied to those networks. But yeah, you want to exercise a lot of caution when doing financial matters, and utilizing sort of things like public unsecured Wi-Fi, which is really an easy sort of hunting ground for imposters, and I wouldn't even say sophisticated fraudsters. You don't really need to be that sophisticated to do those things in the public space. But again, I would emphasize, ensuring that your details are maintained and kept up to date, such that should anything happen in the sort of electronic sphere, that the organizations like ourselves that are managing clients' money notify clients sort of as and when any activities happen on their investments or their accounts. Okay. I would sort of wrap up by saying that I think 10, 15, 20 years ago, I think you protected yourself by avoiding being or having an electronic footprint. I think in today, kind of fast forward 20 years till today, you have an electronic footprint whether you like it or not. You have your identity particulars at companies like Home Affairs, government institutions, etc., and sort of not actively participating in the electronic ecosystem is really drives ignorance around any potential risks that might exist with regards to your particulars being out there.
Okay. Zamani, I want to come back to you. What I'm hearing, there's quite a few controls we can put in place. Not one control works in isolation. There's quite a few layers that we have to get through. And it's important that clients and advisors pay attention to all of these. One of the things Faizil's talking about as well, looking at an advisor, they're not sitting at a desk all the time. They're often on the road, meeting with clients. So they don't always have the liberty of opening a laptop and logging on to Allan Gray online or whichever other platform they are. And so I can, but being a client as well, for ease of, servicing friction, they're chatting over WhatsApp as well. They have a Gmail account. It's easy on your phone. A lot of clients probably talk to their advisors through the methods like WhatsApp, Gmail, those sort of things, which aren't always the most secure as well. Is there anything you can give advisors advice on in terms of that?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good question. And I think you've got to take a step back and almost, as cumbersome as it is, really highlight to clients what are authorized mechanisms of communication, right? And highlight kind of it is actually for their benefit. Because you don't want to be in an instance where, a fraud happens and it was actually done because it was using a channel that was not verified. That's just, Felicia's talking about all of these great data management and data policies, but, if you're not following them, there's not much use to it, right? So I think it's about highlighting that aspect. And again, I think when you have a client, to your point, you're dealing with very financially sensitive transactions. You want to make sure that a client understands the repercussions if they're going to send you something on WhatsApp. The potentiality is there for you to lose whatever X amount of retirement funds or investments that you have with a particular entity. So I think it's about, and I'm sure Allan Gray does this on an ongoing basis as well as kind of advisors, right, is to make sure that you're bringing that awareness on a continuous basis to your clients.
And then last question I have for you, Zamani, looking at all these AI considerations, you have things like ChatGPT out there as well. What are some of the ethical considerations advisors should consider? Yeah,
I think, ChatGPT, there's in my opinion, a warrant out on its use case in the wider business environment, right? And I'll give you a low resolution of what that example is from an IP infringement perspective. So let's say you've trained this particular model to understand particular texts and texts from like William Shakespeare, or let's take some more recent like Roald Dahl. what's the copyright infringement from any outputs that particular chatbot produces? Do they pay that royalty to Roald Dahl, or are they infringing on that? And then if you use that in the advisor space, and again, advisors will probably use it because it's super productive, but and useful. But then you've got to also understand: are you disclosing and allowing that particular application to process information that is actually in your custodianship? So it's a little bit of a weird one, and I think going forward, the US and especially in the UK, the jury's out as to how are these models trained, the actual outputs being used. If the information it was used from is patented, how do what's the financial model around it? So it's very weird, and to go back to the crux of it from an ethical perspective around how advisors should be thinking about it, I would be inclined to kind of lean back and not use it unless there's a particular vendor that's willing to onboard the liability of that particular use. And what I mean by that is that if you go with a vendor that says, look, we have this piece of generative AI that's going to make a particular function a lot easier, and we're willing to to bear the risk of anything going wrong, yeah, by all means, you can investigate that. But from using ChatGPT within your own business or generative AI in the wider instance, I think there needs to be a little bit more of a keen eye on that.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for your input. Thanks for joining us today. And that concludes the 2024 Ethics webinar, Navigating the Ethical Side of Client Data Management. I'd like to thank our presenter and panelists for their insights. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you have found the webinar valuable.